Find other great podcasts like this one at podmoth.network.
We are the Brutal, Bizarre, and Boozy Podcast. I'm Declan, the son.
And I'm Jane, the mom. This is the podcast where we talk about brutal crimes like serial killers and the random one-off murder. We will tell you about bizarre occurrences like alien abductions and monsters in the dark. And we just might get you drunk with cocktails themed around one of our stories.
At the very end of every show, we like to lighten things up and cleanse the palate from the tragic and terrifying stories. So we end our time with a chaser. You might get to hear crazy stories about our pets or just silly movie recommendations.
Give us a listen. We are the Brutal, Bizarre, and Boozy Podcast.
Excitement. That's what the kids at the Walter E. Fernald State School, located in Waltham, Massachusetts, likely felt when they found out their participation in a newly formed science club meant that they would receive gifts and go on trips to baseball games. Many of them weren't outside the walls of the institution much. They sat in the day rooms on the large wards or stared at the ornate tin ceiling from their beds, and such luxuries would have been highly regarded by the residents. They were excited, I bet, to have the chance to remove themselves from the Fernald School, a place that painted them with the stigma of mental illness. Nearly half of the children housed at Fernald, however, were not mentally disabled at all. Rather, they came from poor families and had low IQs because they were uneducated. Some were at the school because their parents couldn't afford to care for them, while others had been orphaned. The parents of some of the children received consent forms to join this special club. It read as follows: Dear parent, in previous years we have done some examinations in connection with the nutritional department of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, with the purposes of helping to improve the nutrition of our children, and to help them in general more efficiently than before. For the checking up of the children, we occasionally need to take some blood samples, which are then analyzed. The blood samples are taken after one test meal, which consists of a special breakfast meal containing a certain amount of calcium. We've asked for volunteers to give a sample of blood once a month for 3 months, and your son has agreed to volunteer, because the boys who belong to the science club have many additional privileges. They get a quart of milk daily during that time and are taken to a baseball game, to the beach, and to some outside dinners, and they enjoy it greatly. I hope that you have no objection that your son is voluntarily participating in this study. The first study will start on Monday, June 8th, and if you have not expressed any objections, we will assume that your son may participate. Sincerely yours, Clemens E. Benda, M.D., Clinical Director. Now, if the parents had read between the lines, or asked any clarifying questions, they likely would have seen that this science club would be doing a lot more than just eating breakfast and receiving various perks. However, this was not the case. The club would exist only for one reason: to provide two groups, a cereal company and a private research university, unique access to a group of subjects that would provide both parties with unlimited research potential. And that is where the story gets dark. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the ODDentity Podcast on the Podmoth Media Network, your foray into the weird, wonky, and sometimes downright spooky. This time around, we're going back in time and checking out a science club that turned out to be something else entirely, and we're giving an oatmeal company and a prestigious institute of higher learning a massive side-eye. That's because this episode is all about the Quaker Oats and MIT plutonium experiments. Unfortunately, a lot of the research materials I've come across don't use friendly language when it speaks of marginalized communities affected. I've done my best to edit where needed to make this episode more PC, but I also feel that it's important to present the information in an authentic way and not to glaze over certain aspects of the life and times of the residents of the Fernald School. The majority of old asylums were terrible places that abused and neglected men, women, and children. This is a fact. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, this episode won't be a walk in the park. If you think that this information might upset you, I'll see you on the next episode. If you're going to stick it out, let's begin. State institutions like Fernald, there were nearly 100 just like it across the United States at the time, were designed to house and isolate children that society deemed to be, quote, feeble-minded. It was founded in 1888 as the Experimental School for Teaching and Training Idiotic Children, and it was the product of the American eugenics movement. They wanted to improve genetic stock as well as society in general, and they did so through forcible sterilization. Fernald locked away children from any sense of normalcy found in the outside world, and instead of offering protection from people who might harm them and education to broaden their horizons, the institution seemed to make it their job to do the exact opposite. That's why the children were so excited. But there's no way that this opportunity was actually called a science club, right? Well, from Snopes.com, quote, "The above permission letter makes clear that the school and the researchers describe the students involved as being part of a science club." Konstantin J. Maltaskos, one of the researchers on the experiments from MIT, testified that the science club aspect of the experiments had been misinterpreted by the press cynically. So to make them feel like they were special, they called it a science group, and the only thing that they got was one meal, maybe two, in their whole career, outside of the institution at the MIT Faculty Club. And as I remember, they got a small present. Fred Boyce, a former student at Fernald who was a participant in the radiation experiments, told People magazine in 1998 that life at the school, run at the time by outspoken eugenicists, was so brutal that a student would volunteer to do anything, including eat arsenic, to get away. Daily life was a numbing mix of boredom and brutality. Boyce recalls how an attendant, watching over a ward of 36 children, would force them to sit on wooden benches for hours with their arms folded. If you unfolded your arms, he says, you were whacked. Any opportunity to escape Fernald was so irresistible, Boyce says, that had the scientists offered an outing in exchange for taking arsenic, he would have agreed. "My hand is up. I want it. We're going to a ball game." Boyce described, quote, being lured into the experiments 5 decades ago with the gifts of Hopalong Cassidy mugs, boat rides, and outings to Boston Braves baseball games. Boyce was instrumental in securing a victory in a class action lawsuit against MIT and Quaker Mills. Even the federal government was involved, and the experiments progressed with their approval and support. The United States Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, as acknowledged in one calcium paper. Authorization for the use of restricted quantities of Ca isotopes in patients institutionalized for mental inadequacy was granted through the Subcommittee on Human Applications by the Isotope Division of the Atomic Energy Commission. The Ca isotope was obtained on allocation from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The government's support of these and other projects partially led to the creation of the Department of Energy Task Force, as described in a report that was published a year later. At a December 1993 press conference, Secretary of Energy Hazel R. O'Leary released documents describing previously secret U.S. nuclear tests, facts about bomb-grade plutonium, and information about fusion energy. The Secretary also made available some documents related to human radiation experiments, particularly the 1945 to 1947 injections of 18 human subjects with plutonium. She committed DOE to the collection and review of historical data about the experiments and undertook to release as much of the information as legally possible. End quote. Let that sink in. The experiments sought to see what effect cereal and other breakfast foods had on the absorption of elements like iron and calcium, and the nutrients were then tracked. Radioactive isotopes of iron and calcium absorbed by the body could be traced with Geiger counters. The experiments were mostly run by a PhD student at MIT named Felix Bronner. He was, during the time some of these experiments were conducted, funded as a Quaker Oats Fellow. Quaker Oats continues to deny their participation to this day, saying that they donated the cereal and gave a, quote, small research grant to MIT. The letter sent to the families of students said nothing about their child being exposed to radiation. So why were the kids at the Fernald School a good fit for the experiments? And why would the researchers be particularly drawn to them? Well, as I mentioned previously, these kids were at a disadvantage. Some had no parents, no visitors, no time outside the institution. Even the participants that had family members who had people visiting them had no real way to explain what was happening to them. The parents and children may not have had access to education or advocates for them. When they received the letter from the institution, they likely didn't understand the content, and given that there was zero mention of it, they had zero clue that their kids would be exposed to radiation. These kids were part of a marginalized group who had nobody in their corner. The thought of being able to leave the institution was likely a bright light to them, one at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. Quaker and MIT agreed in 1998 to pay to settle a class action lawsuit that covered about 30 people. I believe there were 100 involved. MIT said that the exposure to radiation was about equal to the natural background radiation that people were exposed to from their environment every year. The university also noted that a state panel in 1994 determined that the students had suffered no significant health effects from the experiment. There was still that pesky little matter of the violations to their civil rights. And to this day, Quaker Oats denies any wrongdoing. So the next time you sit down to enjoy your Quaker Oats, spare a thought for the kids at the Fernald School, and consider how it is that we as a society continue to other outside groups and use them to facilitate our own needs or feed our fears. That's it for this week, dear listeners. Tune in next time for more tales of the creepy, weird, and paranormal. Until then, stay spooky. Find the Odd Pod on Instagram at Identity Pod or on Facebook as the Identity Podcast. Also, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review and share this episode with a friend. Be sure to mash that subscribe button so that you're in the know when a new episode drops.